So, hello and a warm welcome from my side. Thank you for joining us again after the break. So we will kick this panel off with some input, but this input is only going to start as soon as my amazing panelists are actually joining me on stage. And I would actually start calling them to join me here. That's first Miriam Partington from Sifted.
Feels very far away from you, but
well, you chose
luckily
that spot, right? I mean, there is also the sofa over next to me.
I didn't want to be in the middle, so.
Then we have Felix Valtin from Halsey. And we have Trin Vinamagi from Sea Ventures. So before you get to know us a little better, we wanted to make sure that we actually set the tone for this conversation. We very deliberately chose to also include this topic in our agenda, as for us as female founders and also as investors, it's very important to actually address the elephant in the room. And that is the question of where do all the women go? In this conversation, we especially focus on the topic of gender diversity. It's very important for us to mention that we are very well aware that this is, of course, not the only aspect that diversity brings along these days, as the topic of gender diversity is the one that also Female Founders is focusing on, and where we are also the most confident in actually speaking up on. This is what we will focus on in this conversation, but happy to also continue conversations in future events also on other aspects this topic brings along. And to make sure that we have a common understanding of what the issue actually is, we brought along a few numbers and also quotes that we are going to pick up on in our conversation later. So, does this clicker do what it should? Not yet. Okay, maybe the person on the slides can just... Yes, wonderful, thank you so much. So what are we talking about today? So what we see here is a representation of men and women in venture capital firms at the moment in Europe, a very recent study. And what we see is the representation of genders also along the hierarchy that you see in a VC. And this is important on the one hand to understand as a founder, but also as a player in the ecosystem. So just let that sink in for a moment. What we see is basically a big gap and disparity. And these are actually already numbers of VCs that participated voluntarily in this study. The numbers are actually a little bit worse, when we are honest. So why are we talking about this now? Because luckily and finally, this is also a topic that is very officially addressed by Sifted and others and has been reported on very thoroughly, which also gives us the confidence to actually have numbers and quotes that we can rely on and that we also like to re-quote, as this is a topic that is very sensitive and we do not want to focus on any stories that we have heard while we were networking, but actually rely also on sources that are credible and have a good reason for speaking up. What follows next, and no worries, I will not read out all these quotes to you, but really also for you to let that sink in and for us as a panel to understand what we will be talking about today, is quotes that are verified and have been reported on by Sifted, and we will talk about that later. And that's also the source that I have used for the quotes to follow on how it is currently to be an investor in the European tech ecosystem. And while this is, on the one hand, an amazing job, it's not always so funny. And luckily or unluckily, sometimes not funny at all. This has several layers, and we will touch upon them in a few minutes. So we're going to touch on the topic of personality, on the topic of due diligence that investors have to do. And we will talk about people and how they behave in certain work environments. And a certain sense of belonging, which is something that for us, as a brand that is very much focusing on community, is very important. And that's actually a very good start for you as the audience to get to know our panelists. And I would ask each of you to introduce yourself briefly and also to share on what stakeholder side you are on at the moment, which is then also reflected in the aspects that you will bring to the discussion. And I would start with you, Miriam.
Hi, yes, I'm Miriam Partington. I'm based in Berlin. I cover the DACH ecosystem for Sifted, which, for those of you that don't know, we are the Financial Times-backed tech and startups publication HQ'd in London. So I cover the DACH market, but I also spend a lot of time reporting on and thinking about VC and what goes on behind the scenes of VC, as you've seen from my reporting on the slides here.
Thank you so much.
Hi everyone, my name is Trin. I'm the founding partner of C Ventures. We're investing in gender diverse founding teams, therefore most likely female-led businesses. I have been in venture capital for about 7 years and deployed capital on behalf of other funds, but I've also been on the founder's shoes for more than a decade. Great to be here today.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm Felix. I'm a co-founder and CEO at Healthy. We're a hybrid healthcare startup based in Vienna. And before I founded Healthy a year ago, I was a VC at Speed Invest here in Vienna as well, where I was in charge of healthcare investing for around 4 years or so.
So thank you for joining me today, and also thank you for joining in on a discussion on a rather sensitive topic. Also representing some of the voices today that deliberately stayed anonymous. And that's exactly also where I would want to kick this off with you, Miriam, in understanding a little bit better the reporting that you and your colleagues at Sifted have done over the past months, how you decided to really bring this up in a way that is credible and can be grasped by an audience and can be a discussion starter also.
Yeah, sure. So I think, you saw the article that was an exodus of women leaving VC. And I just want to point out that this article isn't in isolation. This is an article that is, in a context of 3 years of reporting on and listening to the stories of women in VC and men in VC, of what goes on behind the scenes at funds. It's very, very good to have a network of people who are very willing to speak openly and honestly with journalists. I think at Sifted we try to come across as approachable people that you can just kind of tap on the shoulder at a conference. But we spend a lot of time meeting people, getting to know them. And I think we've become a media where people can reach out to us, whether it's with their own experiences, whether it's to blow a whistle on something. And so with the process of reporting on women leaving VC, again, over the last year, we have received so many emails, so many kind of WhatsApp messages or whatever it is about the current environment and the challenges that women are facing. And we started to kind of, top up all of these numbers and realize that actually this is kind of a trend. And obviously it's difficult, right? Because there isn't a specific number or a specific set of data that we have. And that was some of the criticism that we got actually was, well, you've got a few quotes in this piece that are anonymous, but you don't have any proper numbers. But it's very, very difficult, right? Like, number one, who is collecting this data? We don't have access to any data set. If anybody knows of any data set about who comes in and out of the VC industry, then I'd really like to know. So that's kind of one of the main challenges, really, is just the numbers part of things. So we can only go off personal stories and just the network that we have and the trust that we've been able to build with people.
Speaking about trust, as you're also collaborating with a lot of these VCs, or maybe not collaborating, but covering them in other stories, many of them are also speaking at events that Sifted is hosting. Have there been any, on the one hand, positive effects? I hope so, but have you also had people calling up Sifted saying like, why are you doing this? It's basically also, going a little bit too deep into the dark corners of the industry?
That's an interesting question. I mean, to be honest with you, the response that we had was mostly positive, I'd say. A lot of women, I think, felt vindicated in a way that, if they haven't spoken out before, they kind of felt like, oh, okay, there's other women that are speaking out about experiences that I've actually had myself. And I did have a lot of people messaging me on LinkedIn or WhatsApp afterwards saying, hey, I saw your article, this is my experience, if you want to speak about this further, then I'd be really willing to. And like with anything, like with, we did this big piece on DN Capital about, the sexual harassment allegations. Like with that, often it just takes one voice or a couple of voices to come forward to really create a movement. And I think that's kind of what we achieved with the Women in VC piece, because now I have so many people that I can go to. Unfortunately, lots of them have left the industry, of course, but these are people that I can still keep in touch with and who still have that knowledge and that experience to share. So I think it was a valuable thing to have done.
Wonderful, thank you. So Trin, when you are also talking to startups, as you're also an active investor and joining boards and just being around in the ecosystem where all of us are represented to some extent, what's your experience on the one hand from the conversations with the teams that you're talking to? Is this something they are aware of and also address actively, maybe even a concern to them? And how do you navigate in that arena?
Sure. I would say that I think founders tell us oftentimes that we are recommended to reach out to female partners. That's what they often get as a feedback. And then they do reach out to female partners, but that oftentimes doesn't necessarily help them to push through the deal internally. So the deal falls through. And we've been talking a lot with our founders around, should it be a female partner or a principal or any junior role, or should it be a male? Because does it have more likelihood that their deal is actually going to be pushed through? Because most of the decision makers today in venture capital are still men. So this has come up very often. I look at it from a little bit of a different perspective as well, because I started in venture capital. I took a step down. I started as an associate. And what I've seen, it's really hard in venture capital to move up in the career ladder, because it's not as straightforward path for you to move from associate to partner, and it doesn't happen that quickly. So what I saw at the time was that's a very kind of steady, slow growth, and I think a lot of women just change their career path before they get there. In terms of the founders, I think a lot of founders by default want to speak to female partners and female investors. They just feel more comfortable. Because of the lack of women in the industry, they oftentimes end up with speaking with male investors. And I think sometimes women just understand certain sectors better, for example, women's health, certain areas in sustainability, where they can connect with the market. But again, it comes down to who has the power in decision making. And what I've seen from my experience is your title might be a partner, but it doesn't necessarily always mean that you have the voice when you make that final decision and write the check. Because a lot of the firms nowadays only have partners. So it's really hard to validate that as a founder. And I think there's a lot of confusion among founders of who they need to go to.
Yeah, I think that's a super important topic that I would actually like also to touch upon again in the conversation, because I think it can be very helpful, especially for the founders in the room, to really also understand this and also use this in a good way for their own fundraising process. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. So Felix, looking at your story, being an investor now turned founder, so how did you experience the VC industry, which has been very often also been described as, on the one hand, it's a little bit like high school, but not in a good way, and having this sort of, bromances going on. How did you navigate that? And what did you also learn that you are doing maybe different, or also in a positive way? What have you implemented now in your company as a leader of a very diverse set of people?
Thanks. Lots of questions. I mean, first answer is I had my fair share of bromances as well. But I think, to be honest, my perception of the VC industry, and I came into VC quite randomly, to be honest, which actually a lot of people do, so perhaps it's not that unrepresentative, is that VC, as a founder, I think of a lot of things in terms of funnels, and VC is like the bottom funnel. Like, you have a lot of problems in VC, but to be honest, we're inheriting a lot of the issues that we have societally. I mean, VC is a part of the financial services industry, which is a highly problematic industry. which also reflects broader social trends, etc. So I think what goes on in VC is not per se worse than in other industries. I do believe that quite firmly. I work in healthcare. I work a lot with doctors. A lot of our clients are in law firms. These are not better industries for women, I would say.
Sadly.
I think that's a fact, and the numbers kind of across those industries also share that there's. That said, within VC there are just a certain dynamics that make it, that concentrate some of these problems, make them worse. One thing is feedback cycles take forever. We were talking about this earlier. If you're an investment committee, it's basically a lot of people saying a lot of things with very strong opinions about various things that nobody on the table is likely to witness the outcome of. You're making bets about things that happen in 10, 15 years. Very few people are going to be around to witness those. So what does it depend on? Whoever's loudest, whoever's kind of has the strongest arguments in the moment. Whether that was really the right pick of a company that will then exit. Especially in the last 2 years, this has gotten even more scrambled. So it's very hard. So long feedback cycles, one thing. Then another thing is, I think, similar to a lot of partnership organizations like law firms, the big guns are not necessarily the best managers. They're great at building or raising capital or at picking companies. It doesn't mean they're great at running an organization, right? And so, and that said, I've been privileged to work in a VC fund that very much had that ambition of fixing this and also being managers, not just being VCs at the leadership level. So I think that's a problem. If you just look at, large corporates or scale-ups or startups, the people who nurture teams, who give feedback, etc. These are just people who are in the business of building teams, making sure that they're inclusive, moving forward as a teamwork. VCs is more of a lonely industry. You hunt as a tiger, not as a wolf. Like, it's a lonely activity. You're not a pack, right? Even though you often say that. So I think some of these factors just make it particularly difficult in VC. That said, I don't think VC per se is very different from other industries. We have the same problems, or VC has the same problems as other industries, and some features of venture capital bring them out stronger. What I try to do differently in my own work is precisely, I think, this difference between building a company and building a culture. You can do that very differently in a startup because you have longer cycles. You have quicker feedback, but you also have longer term games. In a VC, you want to find a deal, close it, and then you sit back and kind of try and work with the founders, but they're doing the work. In an organization, you really, you get more immediate feedback on, okay, are you pushing people too hard? Then they start getting sick, they'll burn out. Are you being inclusive? Then you suddenly see things happening that you wouldn't have thought possible. So I think really this management aspect is a huge part of the story. And then also, frankly speaking, so I work in health tech, you get different people in healthcare than you get in the financial services industry, and also within health investing in VC. So I really have to say, I've partly avoided, but also never really experienced these highly toxic situations, simply because the health crowd is that we're just nice people, right? And so there's a higher share of women. There's a higher share of women in deal flow. There's more female founders. There's more women decision makers. So in my own organization, we try to build a culture in a completely different sector. We have weekly, bi-weekly, quarterly goals. As a VC, you have like a 10-year time horizon. It's really hard to build an organization around that, actually, I find.
Thank you for sharing that, and I think there were a few keywords that I would actually like to explore also with the rest of the panel, which is on the one hand management styles, especially also connected to mental health. I mean, this is luckily a topic that is widely addressed also within founding teams and also the respective organizations they're building. And Miriam, I know that this was also one of the kick-off points for you to report on, is really the topic of mental health and also psychological safety, which seems to be, in many of the cases that have been reported on, something that, let's put it in that way, could be improved in a lot of the VCs that you have been talking to. So what was your impression there, and also specifically what could be improved?
Yeah, I think it was interesting. So the reason why I kind of started speaking to a lot of investors about mental health and how it's managed in VC is because VCs spend a lot of time advising companies. What policy should you put in place? You should have a mental health platform, whatever it is, but VCs don't turn the lens back on themselves often and be like, what can we put in place to, as you said, support mental health among employees, and also create this kind of culture of psychological safety and the ability to disclose. I think something that many investors have told me over the past year or so is that in a lot of funds, especially smaller funds, they don't have a person, let alone a team, that advocates for the people or HR function. And I think that's a problem in the sense that, a lot of VCs would say VC funds are not companies. They don't have to be run like companies. But I would actually argue that, you do need somebody that is representing the employees and actually saying, yes, we need to have a parental leave policy because we're going to hire women, and we need to have this in place so that they feel that they can take time off without their careers, being neglected. And I think, as we said earlier as well, the second point is that culture starts from the partners, ultimately. And you see this a lot, even in funds that have parental leave policies, for instance, or have mental health policies. If the partners aren't using these things, then no one else in the fund is going to use it. It's the same perhaps in a company. The founders have to set the tone, the founders have to set the culture. I think it's similar with partners, honestly. And I think that's why you get this discrepancy in experience. Some VCs have an incredible career and have a really nice time. Maybe that's because the partners have really set a good tone for speaking openly about things or making sure that people take time off or whatever it is. And other people, other funds, that have partners that kind of work all day, that berate you if you take an extra day holiday or whatever it is, that's also not going to make for a healthy environment. So that's just my 50 cents.
Yeah, I can definitely also reflect on that from our experience with female founders. So we have been working with a lot of VCs, especially when it comes to introducing diversity, equity, and inclusion policies, but also promoting them in our community, connecting them to the startups that are basically community members that we've been sourcing, that we have been supporting. And it's really interesting because a lot of VCs might not have an HR function, but they do have a marketing function. And in marketing, it's also usually women, and they are very much interested in actually talking to us as female founders, and we always appreciate that. And there were actually a lot of partnerships that did not happen for two reasons, because on the one hand, their proposals did not go through on GP level. And on the other hand, there were really cases, and it was really more than once, which was particularly sad, when the marketing person came back to us and they were like, yeah, I can actually not do a partnership with you because this is really against my own personal values, because at the core, our fund does not deliver the values that you are basically spreading and promoting with female founders. And that's super sad to see that like within the funds, it's very apparent rather quickly also what the tone is and where this is heading, and there is this big gap between the marketing world and the outside world and then the inner workings of a fund. And I think also for startups, this is evident rather quickly, and is also something to look out for, because those people, those investors, those check writers are in the best case people that are on your cap table for a very, very long time, which also means if your values do not align, you will have probably a very hard time dealing with them throughout the years on your board. And I know that it's sometimes tough because money is not particularly lying on the street these days. But keeping that in mind and also having a look at that is something that we always recommend to startups regardless of their stage and their setup.
Yeah, just to add to that, even if a fund does have these policies in place, it doesn't always mean that there's buy-in from the entire structure. I was at a conference earlier this year, and it was on kind of VC policy around these things, mental health, parental leave, etc. And a very big fund that has a lot of money, it has these policies in place, but the partner on stage was going, I don't believe in policy. And actually, we hired a woman who was pregnant, and it was a bit risky, but we're doing it. And I was thinking, before the panel, when I was, preparing, I was thinking yeah, this is a good fund then. They obviously understand that this is, an issue and this is something that should be addressed. But then the partner himself, the general partner, founding partner, was just on stage saying the absolute contrary. So, it's also not always about policy and how funds appear. It's about what actually goes on behind the scene at partner level.
Yeah, that's very true. And I think it's actually visible rather quickly these days, which is sometimes also good because it makes the decisions easier on who to work with. But building a portfolio these days, and also in Trinja, also especially working with early stage founders, and then also working with them over a longer time. So how is your experience, and also working with co-investors, and also maybe helping your startups in actually implementing fundraising strategies?
Yeah, it's a good question. We actually love working with both male and female investors because we really believe that we need allies, meaning men, to drive decision-making forward within venture capital to actually back more female-led businesses. So we really are split when we look at the investors we share deal flow with. We don't really choose if we work with a female VC or a male VC. And as it happens, we actually see an increased interest by male VCs to actually get access to our deal flow because they've started to acknowledge there's a problem and they want to address it. And they see an amazing collaboration opportunity to get access to these deals early. So I really love to put like a positive spin on it. I've seen a lot of development in the industry. And the downside oftentimes is that oftentimes these deals tend to be too early. And what we love to do with investor communities is also sometimes educate them on unconscious biases in their investment process, which also comes to unconscious biases in their teams. So I think you can approach with the same methodology on how you operate within your team, asking different questions from male versus female founders, but also giving the voice to your female team members, and how do you ask questions at investment committees that are promotional rather than preventional, and really encourage women in your team to speak up and share their opinions, because not everyone is as opinionated, but that doesn't mean that they're not experts within that industry and don't know the markets well enough. So I think from my experience, what has worked really well internally within teams is when we had, with one of my funds, we all had equal rights to give our opinions. We went through every single investment committee member, and we all had the right to give a vote. So that worked really well. Everyone had a say, everyone could really share their opinions. But interestingly, when I looked at, after 1 year being in the fund, I looked at the companies we had backed. 1 out of 10 was female-led. And then I started to kind of go more in depth into these investment committees and analyze what's really happening around the table. And then I got back to the point I mentioned earlier. Decision eventually is made by the check writers, the managing partners, and whilst we had a split team, somehow the male partners always had a much bigger influence in the decision making. So that's why I actually decided to leave and build my own fund to drive more capital to female founders, because I truly felt that internally I don't have the capacity to do that, and I'm not enabled to do that. And I think that's happening in the market a lot right now. I think a lot of women are leaving the industry because they feel that they're either reaching a glass ceiling, they want to build their own fund, they want to drive their own vision, they are missing impact in the industry, and they're lacking diversity in that impact. And that's one side that I'm seeing a lot in the industry right now, why women are leaving.
I very much agree, but also having raised the fund ourselves, and which is very much going hand in hand with what you have been building, is also the conversation and the topic of limited partners. And Felix, that's actually something where I would like to hand over to you again, as you've also been very involved in the Speed Invest fundraising in your time there. If you could explain quickly, on the one hand, who limited partners are, and also how the process of selection is, because limited partners can actually be drivers in where GPs or VC strategies go, and they could play a very important role. But before discussing that, it would be great to hear that from you.
Yeah, I mean, LPs are the people who pay the party, right? that's very simple. The principals, they have the cash, so it's usually large institutions or ultra-high net worth individuals. And obviously they have massive power. I think this is the single biggest lever you can have, other than like very enlightened individuals in all the right places. The single biggest lever you have in the industry is LPs emphasizing that they insist on a certain, and I'm an old Marxist, so I'm a big believer in quotas and targets. But if you don't have quotas for female deal flow, female founder shares, team quotas across various levels of seniority, these things are just not going to happen. And ultimately, LPs are, I think, the ones who have that leverage over GPs. GPs being general partners who manage the fund. LPs are the ones who are limited partners. They give the cash but have less say. So, but in the selection process, there's, fund due diligence, at least in Europe, where you have the European Investment Fund involved in I don't know, 90% of VC fundraisers, is a very drawn-out process. It's a very systematic process. A lot of these LPs are very sophisticated, take very long-term views, and I think this has really changed over the last 5 to 10 years. They really put an emphasis on this. To be honest, let's see what this looks like in 5 years when, 2-3 years ago, fundraising was a very different story for funds, as you know, than it is now. And so I will be curious to see how much of the progressive aspirations that a lot of these LPs have put out in the last 3 to 4 years will survive the market as it is now, as they retreat to just high yield, no matter the cost. But yeah, LPs really have a lot of sway, and I think that's where to put the thing. And the good news is that even in the US, a lot of LPs are actually non-profits or public organizations, which are actually subject to democratic control of some sort. And so there are paths and ways of using traditional, politics to actually move them in directions that we think are good.
Yeah, I can definitely also confirm that, because at the end of the day, and that's also what I can recommend to founders thinking about their strategy, and also like what are the game changers that can be there. So on the one hand, if it's the check writers that are more diverse, they will build portfolios that are more diverse. But we as the check writers can only do this if we are actually in control of money that we are allowed to invest and take care of, following certain investment strategies. And yes, luckily I can definitely confirm there has been a shift also when it comes to these limited partners who sometimes really have billions of euros and dollars. They are taking care of themselves and then once again investing. But and that's where it's going to be interesting, as the market is really under pressure at the moment. There is this big question of who is really sticking to their initial very ethical targets, and will they connect them to also the financial output, or will they stay with the managers that might have nice returns at almost any costs? So as we are also already moving towards the final round of our conversation here, we want to definitely make sure that while talking about a very serious topic, we are also mentioning the potential opportunities connected to that. Some of them already have been brought to the table by each of you, but I would actually like to start the closing round once again with you, Miriam. Apart from the fact that taking care of humans, also regardless of gender, background, etc., so really taking care about building teams, mental health, and then also promoting and progressing, what is the lever that you see could really change something?
I think we need to, as an industry, not just VC, but also the wider tech industry, think about what channels we can put in place for people to blow the whistle. And this is something, again, to bring up the DN Capital topic, this was something that we thought a lot about at Sifted, and we actually asked a lot of LPs, what they can actually do to really push this topic and make sure that VCs are thinking about this. I don't have the answer yet, but I would be very interested to hear from anybody perhaps in this room that has ideas about how companies and funds can put this into place. And maybe it does start with just having that one person at your fund that, as I said earlier, advocates for the people side of the business.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. We need quotas.
Yes, we do. Very much agree.
Yeah, I mean, this is really, I mean, every founder who's building a company gets this. If you don't have a target, you're never going to reach it, right? So you need targets, and if it's not binding or if compensation isn't tied to it in some way, it will just not happen. You can have all the wishes you want if you don't have a, and the ugly name for a target is a quota, but it's just a target. You need a target.
Yeah.
Simple.
I very much agree.
Yeah, and I would add to that, from a founder perspective, you actually have a lot of power. You can prefer a fund that has more diversity to another one, right? And what I've seen recently is a lot of female founders that I work with, they come to us and they say, we really want you on board. They even fight for us on the cap table because we bring the diversity in the thought process of the journey of the business. So I think you have the power to really choose the funds that have more diversity, and I think funds become almost a bit more competitive around it, because some funds are more diverse and they have access to certain deal flow that the others don't. So that's what founders, I think, can do. And from an internal perspective, from venture capitalists, I think women should be given the same fair, equal opportunities as men do. That means equal pay, equal carry, equal opportunities to sit on boards. There's no way you can develop from an associate to a partner without sitting on boards. Unfortunately, these opportunities are often given more likely to male rather than female investors because they tend to be louder in the room and more vocal, perhaps. And I think instead of just mentoring women, we just need to give them an opportunity to make their own mistakes and encourage them to speak out and give them the board seats and learn as they grow.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, and please go ahead.
There's also just a very simple rule in VC. It's just don't work with assholes. I mean, it's whether they're male or female doesn't really make a difference. It's ultimately, if you have an investor on board, you're going to have a lot of difficult and nice discussions with them. But you're really choosing a partner for a long, potentially, journey. And so just don't pick an asshole. If this is like some young dude who's just, whose behavior is just not what you're expecting, also ask to speak to someone else. I mean, it's really that's something people will pick up very quickly. Oh, interesting. This associate or principal, whatever, is just finding it easier to have these conversations with founders. That's something I think GPs are very alert to. So walk with your feet or whatever it is you do. Just walk away from people you don't have a good connection to. You're probably not going to get their money anyways. So don't do it.
That's very true. I mean, really also the big support of trusting your gut feeling. And that's really also a learning that we had to make, now turned back into the investment community, so running the fund now for 1 year. And I think the biggest learnings we had in this past 12 months was really out of situations where we worked against our gut feeling. Because we're like, okay, on paper, following assumptions, following a thesis, we should do this. And unfortunately, it always backfired. I mean, it was good, it backfired rather fast, so we had the opportunity to learn fast and actually also prevent like bigger mistakes or bigger problems. But that's something that I see, especially also with people raising money for the first time, that are like, yeah, well, but this brand is so nice, or this title of the person is so nice, I should definitely talk to him or her, and then working against your gut. And that's, go with the flow. In the very positive case, and you will usually be rewarded for that.
Can I also add, I think we should really pay attention to women who are more experienced in the funds supporting other women, and that goes the same in your organizations as startups, right? When you have more experience, you have a higher title, higher ranking in your title. We shouldn't make it harder for future generations, even if it was so hard for us. We should really support them and pave the way for them, right? And this is what I've experienced a lot in my journey, and I think that's really missing in European market. We really need to collaborate more.
I'd just like to add as well, on the topic of women leaving VC, it's not all bad. There are some women like you that have gone on to raise your own funds. I know of a couple of women now that are raising their own solo GP funds. And also there's a trend of women leaving VC because they want operational experience. So they're going into startups to be chief of staff or whatever it is. So it's not all bad. In fact, it could also be a good signal for the founders and investors that are going to come out of the ecosystem in the future. So
definitely ending on a positive note here. I would actually like to say thank you to the three of you for also bringing your personality to this discussion and also for joining in on this topic. And thank you everyone for listening actively and hopefully having takeaways to implement in whatever position you are in, because regardless if you are the CEO or just starting out in your career, you can make a difference. And please never forget that.